Okay, let's unpack this. We're taking a deep dive into a very specific kind of dark corner of history today.
Yeah, the late ninth century, the Carolingian Empire's decline. It's dramatic stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But we're not looking at it from, the usual perspective, the throne room or the battlefield.
No, exactly. We've got this really fascinating source, or what's presented as excerpts from one. It's called Shadows of the Frankish Crown.
Right, and it gives this incredibly personal first-person view, which feels quite rare for the period.
It really does. It's a narrative of, well, betrayal, serious rebellion, and a pretty chilling assassination at its core.
That's what makes it so compelling, I think. So our mission here in this deep dive is to really dig into this story.
Understand the context, the historical backdrop it's describing.
Yeah, and pull out the key insights, especially about those less visible forces, the shadows, as the title suggests, that were really shaping things back then.
And it's got all the ingredients, hasn't it? You've got this empire basically crumbling.
A major city,
Yeah.
Paris, under this brutal year-long siege.
A king who makes a, well, let's just say, very controversial call,
And this secret group, Le Main Noir, operating behind the scenes.
culminating in this assassination on a feast day, no less, in public.
It really makes you think, doesn't it, how seemingly small actions, these hidden things driven by personal motives, can just send these huge ripples through history.
Absolutely.
So let's get into it. Let's explore how this one perspective, this one voice, illuminates such a crucial moment.
Okay, so the source sets the scene around 886, and it uses some pretty strong language. It says the Carolingian Empire was rotting.
Rotting, wow, that's blunt.
It is. It says what Charlemagne built had completely splintered into brittle, bickering kingdoms.
That's such a powerful image. You think of Charlemagne's huge realm across most of Western Europe.
Right. And now it's just fragile pieces fighting each other.
So what were the big pressures here, according to the source?
Well, it points to two main things. First, the internal stuff, constant strife, loads of ambitious nobles trying to carve out their own power bases.
Standard medieval politics, maybe, but it sounds like it was really bad then.
Exactly. And then you layer on the external threat. The source specifically calls out the Norsemen.
The Vikings, still a major problem.
Oh, yeah. Their dragon-proud ships still prowl the rivers. So it's this combination, decay from within, assault from without.
And smack bang, in the middle of all this chaos, the source zooms in on Paris. What was Paris actually like back then?
Yeah, it's important to remember, Paris in 886 wasn't, the Paris we think of. It was much smaller.
Just the island.
Pretty much. The source calls it a walled island fortress nestled within the arms of the Seine, mostly the Ile de la Cité.
So what would it look like, feel like?
It describes a cluster of wooden and stone buildings, fortified with defensive towers. And the smell, smoke and wet earth, very visceral.
And it mentions the bridges, right? Count Odo's bridges.
Yes, the newly fortified bridges of Count Odo, which were absolutely crucial for defense. Odo himself becomes a huge figure, of course.
Yeah, the defender of Paris, later king. So this island fortress, the source says it was crammed with markets, hovels, and churches. And it went through something terrible.
It really did. A brutal Viking siege lasting almost a year.
Almost a year. Just imagine being trapped on that small island for that long under constant attack.
The source paints a grim picture of the aftermath. The city was left half-starved, half-mad, and wholly furious.
Half mad, wow. And that fury, it wasn't just directed at the Vikings, was it?
No, not at all. The source makes it very clear a lot of that anger was aimed squarely at their king, Charles the Fat.
Right, whom the source dismisses as emperor in name only. So Paris suffers for a year, calls for help. How does Charles respond?
Well, this is the crux of it. It was a decision that caused outrage. He answered their pleas not with swords, but with silver.
He paid them off, bought off the Vikings.
He bought them off, exactly, instead of sending an army to relieve the city.
Just gave them money to leave?
But it gets worse. The deal also allowed the Norse fleet to sail further inland to plunder Burgundy.
What? So he basically paid them and gave them permission to go raid somewhere else in his own empire.
That's how it was seen. Not just weakness, but an outright betrayal of his people. And this is where the narrator's story begins. He says quite explicitly, I was born from that betrayal.
Born from that betrayal. That's a powerful origin story right there. So who is this narrator, this I?
He calls himself Eloi le Sombre, Eloi the Dark. He mentioned his real name is lost to time, probably intentionally obscured.
And his background sounds, well, pretty rough based on the text.
Extremely. He describes himself as a monk's bastard, raised in a monastery.
Which explains how he could write, presumably.
Right, he learned to write in Latin. But then there's this chilling line. He also learned how to slit throats in silence.
Good grief.
Huh.
So literate and lethal, that's quite a combination.
It paints a picture of a very harsh upbringing, doesn't it? Forging very different kinds of skills.
And his motivation seems really tied to personal trauma from this whole period, things he saw.
Absolutely. He mentions specific, terrible events. He saw the Norse burn the convent of Saint-Benoît.
Okay.
And even more personally, he says he saw his mother thrown from the walls of Paris when the garrison rationed food during the siege.
Oh, that's horrific. So he connects all this suffering directly to the king's inaction.
Directly. He says, I saw King Charles do nothing, so I joined the rebels.
But not just any rebels, right? He makes a distinction.
Yes, he's very clear. Not the noble rebels with banners and honor, he says, but the hidden ones, the ones operating in the shadows.
And this is where we get introduced to this group, La Main Noire.
La Main Noire, the Black Hand. And their methods were clandestine, to say the least. Assassins, saboteurs, liars in the king's ear.
So undermining the empire from within, unseen, were they just in Paris?
Oh no, the source suggests their reach was much wider. It gives examples like killing tax collectors in Lyon, poisoning a bishop loyal to the emperor in Metz, setting fire to grain meant for imperial armies in Verdun.
Wow. So a network of agents causing disruption all over the place.
Exactly. Undermining imperial authority piece by piece. But the source emphasizes, for Eloi and the group, Paris was always the heart.
The symbol of the betrayal.
Precisely. And Eloi apparently developed his own signature. He signed his kills with no name at all, only the mark of a broken crown.
A broken crown, a direct message to Charles, presumably. Okay, so the narrative brings him back to Paris after the siege.
Yes, in the spring of 887, he slips back into the city as a merchant servant, blending in.
And what was the city like then? Still showing the scars?
Oh, definitely. He describes seeing burnt homes, twisted iron, the half-sunken Norse longship left rotting by the eastern bridge. Constant reminders of the siege.
But it wasn't just physical damage, was it? The mood.
No, that's crucial. The source says, but beneath the ruin was fire. People had not forgiven the king. That anger, that sense of betrayal was still very much alive.
And Eloi returns with a specific mission, a target.
He does. A man named Count Heinrich of Thuringia.
And who was he?
He was Charles's envoy, sent by the king specifically to reassert imperial control over the city now that the siege was over.
Ah, so the king is trying to clamp down again after abandoning them. Heinrich must have been pretty unpopular.
You'd imagine so. And he wasn't taking chances. He was quartered in a stone hall on the island under the protection of 20 Frankish knights.
20 knights. So a direct attack is out of the question for one man.
Exactly. And Eloi makes that clear. His goal wasn't a battle, he says. My job was not to fight them. My job was to remind the empire what fear felt like.
A symbolic act, a terror attack, essentially.
Precisely. Aimed at sending a message loud and clear.
Which brings us to the assassination itself. The source gives quite a bit of detail here.
It does. It sets the scene really vividly. It happened on the Feast of Saint-Denis.
Patron saint of Paris and France, so a big public occasion.
Exactly. As the bells rang and the people gathered in the plaza outside the church, lots of noise, crowds, distractions, perfect cover.
And how does Eloi get close to Heinrich with all those guards?
He infiltrated the location. He entered the hall dressed as a scullion, a kitchen hand, anonymous, easily overlooked, blending in, and the weapon, very cleverly concealed, hidden a blade in the handle of a wine jug.
Turning an everyday object into, well, a murder weapon. So when does he strike?
So the source describes the moment Count Heinrich leaned back to taste the vintage from the jug, Eloi presumably offered him.
A moment of relaxation, unsuspecting.
Exactly. And that's when Eloi moves. He apparently leaned in close and whispered something.
What did he whisper?
Just 4 words, according to the source. This is for Paris.
Right to the point. Directly linking the act to the city's suffering, the king's failure. And then?
Then, swift, brutal action, I slit his throat and vanished into the crowd before his blood soaked the floor.
Vanished into the chaos of the feast day. Efficient, terrifying, and anonymous apart from the message.
Exactly. Maximum impact, minimal chance of getting caught right then.
So the source then talks about the consequences, right? The ripple effect of this one killing.
Yes. Heinrich's death, this targeted assassination of the king's envoy, apparently sent tremors through the realm.
Just as Eloi intended then, reminding the empire about fear.
Precisely. And the political fallout for King Charles was, well, immediate and severe. The source says Charles, already weakened by illness and betrayal, was blamed for the growing unrest that Heinrich's death seemed to ignite.
So this assassination acted as a kind of catalyst, on top of everything else that was going wrong for Charles.
It really seems like it, according to this narrative. It became a focal point for the discontent. The source states the nobles turned on him. By the end of the year, he was deposed, cast aside like a useless relic.
Wow, that quickly. From envoy killed in the spring to deposition by year's end.
A very swift downfall. And the source adds he died a year later alone and broken. Pretty bleak end for an emperor.
And the bigger picture, the empire itself.
The source connects it directly. The Carolingian Empire crumbled, and in its ruins, new kingdoms rose. Now, obviously, historians wouldn't say this one assassination caused the empire's fall.
No, of course not. It was a long process.
But this narrative presents it as a key event, a significant blow that accelerated the end of Charles's reign and, symbolically, the disintegration of that unified empire.
What about Eloi himself? Does the source say what happened to him after this?
His account just says, I disappeared. His ultimate fate is left ambiguous.
No clues.
Well, the source mentions rumors. Some say I fled east and taught the Slavs our methods, which is an interesting, if unverifiable, idea. Others say I took holy orders and repented.
Two very different paths. But does Eloi himself offer a final thought?
He does. He rejects the rumors and offers his own truth, his own perspective on his role in these massive events. He says, but I know the truth. I watched the empire fall.
How?
Not with a trumpet's blare, but with the soft sound of blood on stone.
Wow. That's incredibly stark. Poetic almost? Emphasizing the quiet violence beneath the surface.
It really is. And the source concludes with this powerful line. But for a brief moment in the dying years of a fat king's reign, a shadow moved through Paris and made emperors tremble.
A shadow that made emperors tremble. It really sums up the perspective of this source, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And what's so valuable about digging into a source like this, even if its origins are debated, is how it forces you to look beyond just the dates and the big political shifts.
Right. It gets you down to the human level, the motivations behind specific actions.
Exactly. This one act of violence, born from very personal grievance, becomes this catalyst in a moment of huge instability. It shows how forces operating outside the official channels of power can have a massive impact.
It really highlights that history isn't just made by the people whose names we always remember, the kings and generals. It's also shaped by these hidden currents, these individuals like Eloi, driven by their own intense experiences.
It underlines why it's so important to look for these other perspectives, these narratives that show you the messy, complicated reality under the surface of those grand historical events.
So thinking about this for you listening, this deep dive into shadows of the Frankish crown, it really demonstrates the power of getting into the details of a specific source.
How one account can light up a whole period in a different way.
Exactly. It reminds you that understanding history isn't just about knowing who was king when or the dates of battles. It's also about grasping the human stuff. The betrayals, the suffering, the anger, the hidden actions, the personal pain that can genuinely drive huge changes.
Looking for these shadows, these less obvious stories, helps you see the full picture, the complexities of any historical period.
Maybe even our own times, Understanding those hidden dynamics is always relevant.
It definitely raises a fascinating question to leave people with.
Absolutely. Think about this. How much of history, particularly during these big, messy transitions like the fall of the Carolingians, might have been shaped, maybe even fundamentally altered, by countless other shadows?
People whose names are completely lost to us.
Whose actions were never recorded or maybe attributed to someone else entirely? People acting out of their own specific circumstances, their own pain and motivations, just like Eloi Le Sombre in this account. How much of the story do we actually not know?
It's a humbling thought, really. Makes you reconsider how history is written.
It certainly does. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into a moment when one shadow in Paris, according to this source, helped make emperors tremble.